A lot of times when people find out that I decided not to go back to the war because I had a real problem with the civilians that we killed in Iraq, they tell me that when you joined the military, you knew you would be killing human beings. You knew that innocent civilians would die, and you had trained for it, and certainly I did train for it. I was an infantryman for 8 years when I deployed to Iraq, and I was a staff sergeant, and I was infantry squad leader. So I had done the training, and I had the knowledge and the expertise to do my job in Iraq. But I was 19 years old when I signed up for the military. At 19 years of age, we're not even able to buy alcohol. Yet, when a young person decides not to participate in war, they want to say that you knew what you were doing when you signed that contract. And this is separate from political opposition to the war. This is separate from being a conscientious objector. This just has to do with just how unnatural it is for a human being to kill another human being. There's no training that prepares someone for that type of experience. This took place in Ramadi, where we were stationed for the most part. And what happened that day was that there was a protest. The Iraqis, the Ramadis, did not want the U.S. military to occupy their country, so they held a rally outside of a government building that we had occupied. And they were holding "No Bush, Yes Saddam" signs. And at one point, the protest got pretty violent because they started throwing grenades. Now, the grenades were meant more to provoke, because the crowd was really far from where we were, and we were in a compound that was walled in. So there was no chance that they could hurt us by throwing these grenades, but they were doing it as a way to protest the occupation. This is from page 89 of the book. Sergeant Williams, my platoon leader, came running back from the first floor with intel from Bravo Company. The first sergeant had told Williams to hold tight as they were getting ready to send out a civil affairs team to try to persuade the crowd to go home peacefully. They deployed a Humvee with an American female translator, a soldier, speaking Arabic through a bullhorn, requesting the Iraqis to leave the area. Then a grenade exploded right next to her Humvee, which was heard speeding off out of the area. "Sergeant Mejia, let's go," said Sergeant Williams. "We're going to the roof to pull overhead security." Sergeant Ritz, another soldier from my platoon, a superb shooter who always carried his sniper scope, came with us. Sergeant Williams placed him in a strategic corner from where he could see the entire rally ground. My squad was positioned along the front of the roof. It was easy to tell when someone from the crowd was going to throw a grenade. The assembly would quiet down all at once and would move as one to one side of the street, far enough away to avoid injury from the blast, but close enough to see where it hit and scream and cheer for it. Bravo Company soldiers, I was in Charlie Company, who were outside in the compound, were yelling at the demonstrators and trying to intimidate them with their weaponry. A black plastic bag landed near one of them and started smoking. They all ran as fast as they could away from it, narrowly escaping injury from a considerable blast. Later reports indicated that some of those throwing explosives were children. The order came to move all friendly elements away from the immediate ground area, and for those on the roof to shoot at anyone who looked like they were going to throw a grenade. So this is when there was actually no danger. The crowd was still in the middle of the street, and I sensed that they saw the withdrawal of our troops from the front yard as a victory. They returned to the area immediately in front of the main gate, yelling even louder and holding their "No Bush, Yes Saddam" signs even higher. At that point, the Iraqis felt quiet again, and everyone moved to the side of the street. They were all looking toward an area of the street that was hidden from our view. I remembered it was a street corner where there was a shop of some kind, with a balcony right above it. It was the same building where one night there had been a short firefight between insurgents and 3rd Platoon. It was said that 2 little girls were shot in their sleep that night, but those reports were quickly denied by the civil affairs people. Now, from a corner of that same building, a young man could be seen emerging from the watching crowd. He was wearing gray slacks and a long-sleeved shirt of the same color. He was very young, perhaps 16 or 17 years of age. I followed him through the aperture of my M16 sight. "What are you doing, man?" I thought to myself. He continued to walk toward the walled-in yard of the compound, which was now deserted. He pulled his right hand out of his pocket, and I could see it contained a small black object. He drew his arm back. I have no memory of squeezing the trigger at the moment that a storm of bullets rained down on that young man, ending his life at once. I remember the grenade he threw exploded near where he died, far from all of us who shot at him. I also remember a couple of old men emerging from the crowd after we ceased fire, their arms held up to show they were unarmed, their heads bent. They grabbed the lifeless body by their shoulders, dragging the young man through a pool of his own blood. They moved back quietly until they were swallowed once again by the crowd, now silent, in mourning for the loss of their son. The rally resumed shortly afterward, and we ended up having to call helicopters to disperse the people. The total body count for that demonstration, unofficial as usual, was 4 dead and several wounded. All were Iraqis. We were told to go back inside the building after the crowd finally left. We had to get ready for more patrols around the city. I went to a dark and isolated corner of the building and sat down for a moment, away from everyone's sight, and removed the magazine from my rifle. I had 19 bullets left, which meant I had fired 11 rounds at that young man. This was the first time that I actually fired my rifle at something that was not a plastic target. But what makes the occupation horrible is not just the death, but also how people are treated and humiliated. And here's one example of that from page 121. We were on patrol. The unbearable heat was putting everyone on edge. The soldiers in the rear of the squad's formation were particularly bothered by a group of small children following behind us, something quite common during patrols. Williams, my platoon leader again, claimed that he had been hit by a rock thrown by one of the children. Kids throwing things at us was commonplace. I remember that during my first patrol in the city, a child threw a rotten tomato at me, which exploded all over my fragmentary grenade and compass pouch. Every time we stopped and confronted the children, they would run like hell, leaving behind only the echo of their laughter. They were playing a dangerous game. After the protest that had turned violent at the mayor's cell, the one I just read about, when our instructions were to fire at anyone who was throwing anything in our direction, including children, we'd heard that some soldiers from other units had more than once opened fire on children for throwing rocks. I'd like to think we hadn't descended to that level, according higher value to human life, especially that of a child. But the heat was really getting to us. We were sweating so profusely that we had to keep patting off our shoulders and backs, and especially our bare necks, where the salt deposits from evaporated sweat really burned the skin. We decided to take a short break by a half-built house, stretching out along the cool shade of his incomplete skeleton. Specialist Funes had a watch that showed the temperature, and according to him, it was reading 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade and 139 out in the sun. The water in our canteens was so hot it was undrinkable. We were exhausted, but we kept our gear on. Everyone except for Williams, that is. He began stripping down, dropping his armor and ammo onto the ground. "I'm going to teach these kids a lesson," he said, taking off his flak vest. "That little one with the red shirt," he said, pointing at the crowd of children, most of whom were barefoot. "That's the one that got me with the rock." Williams was by now stripped down to his bare uniform, losing about 50 pounds. He was a pretty athletic guy, as he demonstrated when he suddenly took off, running after the crowd of kids who quickly dispersed into the side streets. "Man, I can't believe he's doing that shit," said Rosado, one of my team leaders. In a few moments, Williams had caught the kid with the red shirt, who he dragged for 50 meters back to where we were resting. The child looked to be about 8 years old and was crying pitifully as he tried to get loose from Williams's powerful grip. "Aha," said Gallegos, my other team leader, pointing at the kid with a grin on his face. "So you like to throw rocks, do you?" Between sobs, the kid spoke what little English he knew. "No, mister," he cried. "Me no Alibaba." That was a phrase used by pretty much everyone in Ar Ramadi who wanted to deny wrongdoing in the face of arrest, and on rare occasions it worked. But Williams wasn't having any of it that day. "What are you going to do with him, Sergeant Williams?" asked Sergeant Rosado, looking concerned about the child. "I'm going to take this little motherfucker to the base and I'm going to arrest him," answered Williams as he started to put his gear back on. That's the only way these kids are ever going to learn not to throw rocks at us." There was some logic to Williams' idea of making an example out of the kid. The main reaction of most in the squad was one of amusement. Of those of us who weren't laughing, Rosado was the only one saying anything. "But he has no shoes, Sergeant." Rosado's observation was greeted with laughter. "I don't care," continued Williams. "I'm taking this one with us." The children had regrouped at a distance and were now peering in our direction, clearly wondering what was about to happen to their friend. One thing I had noticed about Iraqis was the way they stuck together. People we detained during traffic control point missions, who clearly didn't know one another, were very soon deep in conversation as though they were family or friends from childhood. These kids were no different. Their little group continued to grow as it was joined by some angry adolescents and even adults. "You're not serious about arresting this kid, are you, Sergeant Williams?" asked Rosado, not minding the laughter. "Hell yeah, I'm serious," replied our acting platoon leader, grabbing the kid. "Let's go." An older man then started yelling at us from the gate of one of the houses, but Williams took no notice of him. "Man, that's fucked up," said Rosado as we started to separate the squad into two staggered lines in order to move out tactically. "It's a long way for this kid to go without shoes." Williams kept moving with the kid walking right in front of him, crying uncontrollably. Who knows what was going on in his young mind, but he was evidently drowning in a sea of panic. The other children were warily following the squad, and the older man finally dashed from the steps of his house to join them. Mister, please," said the man as he got to about 10 meters from us. "Child, mister, child." He gestured at the little boy's feet. "There you go, Sergeant Williams," said Rosado. "That's the boy's father. I'm sure he learned his lesson." "No, fuck that," said Williams, who I noticed was using profane language with increasing regularity. He turned to the old man. "Are you his father?" No, answered the man, trying to say more, but unable to find the words in English. He pointed at the house he came from, then at the group of children. It seemed he just knew the kids from the neighborhood and did not want any of them taken away. "This kid," said Williams, pointing at the child, "threw rock at me." Each word spoken came with its own visual translation. "I am going to Arrest him. Williams's hand pointed at the child's hands, which he had restrained with plastic ties. No, no, mister, begged the man, understanding what Williams was saying. Me, he said. You? You what? Asked Williams. What are you going to do? The older man's hands were raised to the level of his eyes, fingers spread apart and pointing upward, his mouth open but unable to speak. We couldn't understand what he was trying to say. The crowd was getting bigger. No, fuck this, said the exasperated platoon leader. We're leaving. But before we could move off, the old man had walked up to the kid and delivered a powerful slap across his tear-streaked face. The child let out a short scream, but did not say anything more. There you go, Sergeant, said Rosado, looking at Williams. Let the old-timer take care of him. Let the child go. Williams thought about it for a moment. No one was laughing anymore. I thought, let him go, Williams. Let the kid go. I was all the way with Rosado, but kept my mouth shut. The older man stared at Williams with a desperate expression on his face. The child was now crying quietly, not looking at either the older man or at Williams. No, was the final verdict. Man, that's really fucked up, Rosado muttered. No one else said a word. The older man landed another hard slap on the child's head, and then a third, this time with his fist. But still Williams appeared unmoved. Man, Sergeant Williams, let him go, man, let the kid go. Rosado seemed to speak the words more for himself than for the kid. The old man now launched a flurry of kicks and slaps on the child, each one harder than the next. Even though the child screamed violently, he never looked up at his assailant, who seemed to be in more pain than the kid himself as he delivered the beating. The entire neighborhood had gathered by then and stood in silence as they witnessed the pounding of the child. Even those in our squad who had laughed at Rosado were now quiet. The kid was no longer crying, but the man was in tears when he tried to plead with our leader. Mister, please, he implored. Williams thought for a moment. Okay, cool, he finally replied. He took out a pocket knife and cut the kid's restraints. You can have him. We left the area and set up and ran a traffic control point for a while before returning to base. The incident was never spoken about again. But when I came to look back on it, I remember how my heart had cried out for me to take a stand alongside Rosado. Yet I had chosen to remain silent, to swallow my moral outrage and go with the crowd, leaving him to fight a battle he should never have had to fight alone. I comforted myself by recalling that when we returned to patrol the same neighborhood a week later, not only did the children no longer throw rocks at us, they didn't even follow us. What Williams had done might well have saved some of those children from being killed for something as minor as throwing a rock at an infantry patrol. The truth, as I see it now, is that in a war, the bad is often measured against what's even worse, and that, in turn, makes a lot of deplorable things seem permissible. When that happens, the imaginary line between right and wrong starts to vanish in a heavy fog until it disappears completely, and decisions are weighed on a scale of values that is profoundly corrupt. That day, I was wrong not to listen to what my better judgment was yelling at me. By ignoring it, I failed not only my own principles, but also the one person who was taking a stand for what was right and decent. This is after a firefight. I was asked to take my squad to some low ground near the Euphrates River to look for enemy dead and wounded. On our way to the low ground, we walked past the dead body of a large man on the side of the road. First platoon soldiers, who were carefully guarding their perimeter with their weapons facing out and away from the dead man, turned their heads to get a quick glimpse of us as we moved stealthily toward the dark bushes. What little we could see of their expressions was not encouraging. It was a familiar look that expressed sympathy and concern above all message. But above all, the message was, better you than me. A small person stood next to the dead man, who appeared to be covered from head to toe with a white sheet. Several people later told me that this was a young child standing next to the corpse of his father. I subsequently tried to remember the boy's face, whether he was trying or looked sad. But the more I tried to remember, the more I realized that there are moments my memory will just never let me revisit. We walked on, combing the small creeks and undergrowth next to the river, but finding nothing. As we returned to relative safety, I was aware that something was preoccupying me, something that would not allow me any measure of peace, but that I could not quite identify. It occurred to me that it was connected with the corpse we had walked by on our way to the river and had passed again moments before on our way back. The child who had been standing next to the body was gone by then. I retraced my steps, telling myself that I was going back to collect Funes, a member of my squad, who had stayed behind talking to soldiers in 1st Platoon. In fact, I wanted to take another look at the corpse. I was curious about where the white sheet that was covering it had come from. I knew we did not carry them. I paused next to the body and stared at it for an infinite moment. What I had convinced myself was the sheet that covered the corpse was just the white robe that the man had been wearing when he was killed. The robe that looked like a sheet that covered the whole body. The robe had looked like a sheet that covered the whole body because the man no longer had a head. The fire from the .50 caliber machine gun had decapitated him. Didn't you see it? Someone would ask me later. Didn't I see what? I asked back, fearing the answer. His head. His head was right next to him by the curb. The widely circulated story following the incident was that immediately after the initial attack, a vehicle had approached 1st Platoon's blocking position at high speed. When warning rounds failed to stop it, the order was given to destroy the vehicle, and that's when a machine gunner had opened up with a .50 caliber machine gun, decapitating the driver, but miraculously missing the child who was in the passenger seat. Thinking about the matter further, and after speaking with a number of people who filled in missing details, I tried to reconstruct my own version of this horrific scene. Perhaps I did see something next to the body, but my mind had told me it was a rock. But had it been that close to the corpse? Had I seen anything at all? And why, when everyone else had recognized that it was a child standing next to the corpse, had my mind erased all traces of his face and clues to his age? Perhaps my memory was playing tricks on me in an attempt to repress images of a story that wasn't just painful to tell, but also to remember. Throughout the whole time that I was in Iraq, I had a deep conflict with a lot of the things that were going on, but I was also very afraid because the situation was so intense that the main preoccupation that I had was to survive. And also because I did not want to rebel in an environment where everybody was being complacent and everybody was being obedient. And I did not want to be the one person to stand up and say that this is wrong. But eventually, I came home for 2 weeks, and then I was supposed to return to Iraq. And that's when I had the peace of mind and the clarity and the time to think about what happened. And when it came the time for me to get back on the plane, I just didn't. I can't say that I had the strength to make that decision to say, this is wrong, therefore I'm not going to be a part of it. I just simply did not get on the plane. But I was too afraid to make that decision, so I just slept when I was supposed to get on the plane. And I told myself that I would go back the next day. And then when the next day came around, I told myself again that I would go back the next day and then the next day. Until one day I realized that I wasn't going back to Iraq. But even at that point, I was struggling with the guilt of leaving Iraq and leaving my unit behind because of the bond that had been built, which was a very special and very strong bond between the men in my squad and myself. Because we had been together in a situation in which, regardless of the politics surrounding it, our lives have been in the hands of one another. So I carried a lot of pain with me as I decided not to go back to Iraq. And this talks about that on page 234. I walked the streets of the massive anonymous cities in the northeastern United States, spending entire afternoons in parks and museums, working on my never-ending Conscientious Objector claim, closing my eyes only to watch my resolve drown in the fear of my eventual public surrender, living in panic of the military and the government, afraid of the future, unable to really live. I felt like a coward for being unable to act on what was clearly my moral duty. Every time I thought of going back to the military and going public with my decision not to go back to Iraq and my denouncement of the war, the deafening pounding of my heart paralyzed me. "You are so courageous," people would say, who knew about my situation. "You are going to lead the way in a new movement of dissent within the military. Many more will follow you." I would nod my head in acknowledgement, registering the words, but often thinking about the punishment that would surely follow, and worrying about my own resolve. And I would think, am I really courageous? I haven't done anything yet. And then other words would come to mind. There has to be a first one, a voice that breaks the silence. There needs to be a first one. And what I needed to do would become clear again. A key event occurred after one of my visits to see Lewis in Massachusetts. Lewis was my attorney. I was accompanied by Nancy Lessing and Charlie Richardson, who had co-founded a grassroots anti-war organization called Military Families Speak Out, which my mother had joined back when I was still in Iraq. After a long conversation with Lewis about my return to the military, Nancy and Charlie took me to a place some 40 minutes outside of Boston that would play a major role in my eventual surrender to the Army, the Peace Abbey in Sherborne, Massachusetts. The Abbey is a place that must be experienced in order to be understood. No words can capture the spirit of the place that later became like a second home to me. A life-size bronze monument of Gandhi welcomes visitors, and the grounds include an animal sanctuary that houses a cow, 3 pigs, a donkey, and 2 goats. The sanctuary is always open for people to spend time with the animals. Just outside the stable, at the base of a small hill, there's a tombstone inscribed with the words, "Unknown civilians killed in war." The memorial was unveiled by former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, war resister, and conscientious objector Muhammad Ali in 1994. A couple of 3-story New England homes flank the stable and overlook an old cemetery just outside of the state. One of the homes is a retreat with 4 rooms for visitors in search of peace and quiet, a multi-faith chapel, a vegetarian kitchen, and a small library with a collection of books about peace and about the atrocities of war. The walls of the Peace Refuge are lined with news clippings about people who have paid a dear price for their peace activism, and with relics of saints and people killed in their struggles for social justice. The first time I entered the house, I was struck by the soothing spiritual music that filled the place with a sense of peace and harmony. I was then surprised by the sound of a mystical yet familiar refrain, the Islamic call to prayer. This was the first time I had heard the call since I had returned from Iraq, and it served as a reminder of the inner connections between people around the world, the unity of humankind that had brought me to the Abbey. In a corner of the main house, inside the multi-faith chapel, there is a shrine dedicated to the late Monsignor Oscar Arnulfo Romero, the Salvadoran archbishop who was assassinated in 1980 because of his commitment to peace and justice, making him the first bishop slain at the altar since Thomas Becket in the 12th century. Photos of the moments after the archbishop's slaying were displayed next to a piece of blood-stained cloth from the altar at which he delivered his last Mass. Monsignor's glasses were on display right next to the blood-stained cloths, enhancing both his powerful spiritual presence and the price he paid for speaking truth to power. On the walls of a hallway of the other house were pictures of children. A legless child, severely mutilated by landmines, stared at me from one of the pictures. Another photo on the wall showed a newborn baby coming to this world only to live a few moments of hell before dying. He had been born with extreme deformities caused by depleted uranium, a radioactive material used by the U.S. military to build munitions and armored plates for vehicles. Upon impact, depleted uranium-based projectiles and armor plates pulverize and get into the air and water, contaminating everything in their path and condemning people, including soldiers, civilians, and even unborn children, to a life of severe pain, deformity, and death by disease. I didn't speak while looking at these pictures, but as I stared at the horrific images, I was aware of a change occurring inside of me. I began to feel ashamed of my fear of going to jail and of being called a traitor. I realized that I had been a coward from the very beginning when I should have refused to be sent to war but did nothing. In Iraq, I had seen and participated in the brutal and abusive treatment of prisoners and civilians, but had lacked the courage to disobey orders. Now, faced with the moral duty to publicly refuse and resist the war, I was paralyzed once again, too weak to break the chains of my own fear. But looking at the faces of those children from times and lands unknown to me, I felt a new resolve and realized that I did have the strength to give myself up and to speak out when doing so. So I eventually surrendered to the military, and I went public in my denouncement of the war and in my refusal to continue participating in what I consider to be an illegal and oil-driven war. And I declared myself a conscientious objector and said, no, I would not participate. And at the time, I was the first combat veteran. We already had public resistors, but I was the first combat veteran to come back from the war and publicly denounce war crimes and publicly refuse to go back to Iraq. So obviously there was a lot of media attention around it, and the case became very politicized, and the military, 2 months later after my surrender, decided to try me by basically a political trial, and they refused to listen to my arguments of abusive treatment of prisoners, torture, the killings of civilians, and violations of several international laws. And we called the entire legality of the invasion into question because we claimed that because the war was not in self-defense, nor did it have the approval of the UN Security Council, it was illegal. But none of that was, of course, allowed as a defense. And I was found guilty of desertion and sentenced, and this is how that happened. Accused and counsel, please rise. We all did. Colonel Nicole, said the judge, you may announce the sentence of the court. Sergeant Mejia Castillo, said the colonel, this court-martial sentences you to be reduced to the grade of E1, to forfeit $795 pay per month for 12 months, to be confined for 12 months, and to be discharged from the service with a bad conduct discharge. When the time came for me to be escorted out of the courtroom to be taken to jail, I asked for a moment to say goodbye to my family. I embraced my stepfather, uncle, aunt, and grandmother. I then turned to my beloved mother. Seeing her reminded me of where my moral strength had come from. She had raised me to always question and to always do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Thank you. There were no signs of defeat on her face. She told me she loved me, and she kissed me goodbye. As I walked out of the courthouse, I was not sad or bitter, nor was I afraid. Instead, I experienced a deep sense of empowerment on that beautiful day. Looking back, I can see what a long trip it had been to arrive at an understanding of my life that today seems perfectly clear. I realize now that my refusal to participate in a morally indefensible war was one I should have made from the very beginning. But it took the experience of going to war for me to see things in a broader perspective and realize that I was deep down a conscientious objector. It can be claimed that a particular war is justified politically, or that it has the support of the international community and the blessing of international law. But these arguments can never convey the images, the sounds, the smells, or anything that remotely depicts the full horror of war. Escaping those arguments is the irreversible damage war always inflicts upon humanity and upon everything worth loving on earth. War, ultimately, is the destruction of life. Even if before deploying to Iraq, I had been convinced by the lies that we were going to find weapons of mass destruction and that we were fighting against global terrorism, and even if all those lies had turned out to be true, there is no doubt in my heart that today I still would hate and oppose all war. There were times in Iraq when I failed to see things the way I was supposed to as a soldier, when I knew that what we call targets were in fact homes, public squares, or markets, when I knew that what we called enemy combatants, terrorists, or Saddam loyalists were in fact people, sons, daughters, parents, human beings. On those occasions, when I destroyed human life in failing to refuse my orders, I also failed myself, my soldiers, the Iraqi people, and humanity. I should have resisted my orders, and I should have fought for the dignity and preservation of life. I didn't because I was too afraid, because even without chains or shackles, I was still a prisoner of my own fear. I knew the right path to take. I knew what my actions should have been, but I didn't feel free to do what in my heart I knew to be the right thing. I now know exactly what it was that so empowered me as I left my trial. Though I was handcuffed as I walked down the steps of the courthouse to the police vehicle, that was the moment that I gained my freedom. I understood then that freedom is not something physical, but a condition of the mind and of the heart. On that day, I learned that there is no greater freedom than the freedom to follow one's conscience. That day, I was free in a way I had never been before. Thank you.
My question is, those of us who have fought this from the very beginning in our own way, we're starting to think now that the only way we'll ever get out of there is if you can go clone yourself, or somehow there'll be more people like you, more soldiers who will resist. Enough soldiers that they just can't do it anymore. Do you think that is going to happen?
I do, but I think that's only half of the equation. Because for soldiers to resist, they need support from the public. You cannot have a movement of veterans coming back from the war, refusing to go back, or people who are serving in the military to refuse to continue participating in the war unless we have a supportive public here. So it's going to take from everyone to stand up and say no more to war and to support the soldiers who are resisting. So yes, but it's going to take more than that.
The U.S. Constitution gives Congress, or assigns to Congress, the right and duty of calling up the militia, which is now the National Guard, but strictly for specifically three purposes: to repel invasion, to put down insurrection, and to enforce federal law. It would seem that use of the Guard overseas then is unconstitutional. Do you know of anyone in the Guard who is pursuing this issue?
No. But I think that the way that things have unfolded, the language is so ambiguous that it basically opens the door to all kinds of violations of the law. For instance, in my enlistment document, because it's not a contract, it's not a military contract, the military can only extend me 6 months after the end of the war without my consent. But there's no war declared on Iraq. What there is the global war on terrorism, which is like the Cold War or the war on drugs. So it has no real beginning. Well, it has a beginning when we invaded Afghanistan, but it has no real end. It could go on for 50 years. So that gives them the ability to move in this very ambiguous twilight zone where they can commit all kinds of violations of the law and quote-unquote get away with it, unless, of course, we don't let them. What would you like 15-year-old students to know about war? Everything. I would like for them to know everything. I would like for 15-year-old students to hear from veterans, to see films like The Ground Truth, to see films like Soldiers of Conscience, which is coming out pretty soon, to see films like Soldiers Speak Out, to see films like Arlington West, Baghdad ER. And there's a number of films out there that they need to see to be able to absorb the entire reality of military life and war. And I don't think that we should be afraid of children consuming this very violent, this very graphic information, because they are consuming it anyway. From the moment they're born, where they start being fed by the society with this violence. I grew up with G.I. Joes and Transformers. Now they have, there's a parody in The Simpsons when there's this cat and like this mouse, and it's so bloody. It's ridiculous, but it's a parody of actual cartoons. This is what really happens. This is what kids are watching when they see cartoons. My daughter, who's 7 years of age, sees stuff like that on Nickelodeon and Disney Channel and the Cartoon Network. So by the time they're 15 or 16 or 17 and they're considering military service, they're already indoctrinated. So we should not be afraid about, bringing this violence that is real about war to our children. That way we can empower them to make a very informed decision, and not just a decision based on what the recruiters are telling them about these glorified stories about war and military benefits and things like that. They need to get the real truth about war. So we should not be afraid of showing them the full picture.
This is a question that strikes near to my heart because I have a nephew that came back from Iraq and wanted to go back. He wanted to go back because he really thought he was doing the right thing. I have entered into arguments with him, but I saw how useless that was. But my question to you is this. I know that some of the figures that I heard was that 70 to 75% of some of the soldiers in Iraq really believe that Saddam Hussein has something to do with 9/11. They really believe that this is a justified war, that there was actually weapons of mass destruction. Can you comment on the psyche of soldiers? How do they deal with the contradiction of the realities around them and what they're being told? And do you sense that there are many others like you who would also, reject this way of life? Can you comment on that?
Sure. Well, Saddam Hussein hanged already. So for people who believe that we went there to get Saddam Hussein, that excuse is expired. That's one thing. The other thing is that other surveys have also shown that U.S. troops in Iraq, more than 70% of them want to be out of that war within a year. And a large number of them, not as much as 70% of them, but a pretty large percentage, said that they would like to get out of Iraq immediately. And this is a pretty old figure. As far as the dialogue or the discussion on the political thing, you have to remember that I was there from April through October of 2003. So things have changed. But the tendency, I would think, is not to have a whole lot of open discussion in the military about politics, because we're so indoctrinated into not expressing our feelings unless they are in agreement with what we're being told by the government. And there's this culture of fear and silence and blind obedience in the military that is really hard to break. But I can tell you that soldiers are really unhappy about the way that the war is being handled. Meaning, at home, the government manipulates the whole support the troops slogan by sending people, yellow ribbon stickers, to put on their bumpers. Meanwhile, the war is costing billions of dollars a week, and soldiers don't have basic necessities. And I'm not trying to make a stronger case for imperialism, but I'm just trying to point out the hypocrisy of saying support the troops while, handing out these no-bid billion-dollar contracts, and the troops are going to war without bulletproof vests and without water and without radio equipment and things like that. So that's creating a lot of disaffection. And I don't have to tell you that I think that this is going to continue to happen. We have over 40 public resistors to the Iraq War. Some of them have gone on to Canada. Some have served prison time. And just on June 19, we had the first public resistor in Iraq. His name is Specialist Eli Israel, and he's in Camp Victory. And he basically said that he's no longer going to continue fighting a war based on lies to protect the interests of corporate representatives. And he's in custody right now. So we do have a rebellion within the ranks. It's not being reported by the mainstream media, but we do have very strong dissent within the ranks. And we're going to continue working on that dissent. I have an 18-year-old brother that is attending boot camp. He wants to be a Navy SEAL. Question, how can I get him out? Boot camp, he wants to be a Navy SEAL. I don't know. Chain him to a tree and have the community feed him bread and water until the war ends. Pass a resolution to make that legal. My parents were both very involved in the Sandinista struggle to overthrow the military dictatorship of Somoza that ruled Nicaragua for over 40 years. So I come from a very political, social justice background. And my parents could not convince me not to go to Iraq. So this is a challenge. This is a challenge. Maybe you can work with the politicians to pass that resolution. I really don't know what to tell you. It breaks my heart, but he wants to be a Navy SEAL. He's totally gung-ho. Hopefully, he'll be able to see the reality of war, and that should be enough to change his mind. But at this point, there's very little you can do for him more than support him the best way you can.
I want to thank you again for coming here. I've been reading your book, and as you were reading it, I was actually reading some of those passages today. Being a Vietnam veteran and Veterans for Peace, in the idea of trying to support Iraqi veterans against the war, we've started here in Portland a GI Sanctuary City movement in which we're beginning to, we've been collecting signatures and we're moving in that direction. But one thing you didn't mention was your time spent in the brig. And how were you treated while you were there? And could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. After I was convicted of desertion and sent to jail, I was adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience. And that led to a massive response from people within the United States and abroad. And I received thousands of letters of support when I was in jail, up to like maybe 20,000 letters. And thank you. And there was also a lot of attention around me, even though back then, public support for the war was really broad. But there were still hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who were against it and who were making sure that I was not alone. And this is why I said that it's so important to have the public come together and support war resistance, because it does make a difference and it does make people feel like they're not alone. And that public support and that attention that I had around me protected me when I was in jail. And every time they try to do something, every time they try to violate my rights, all kinds of alarms would go off. So they backed off. And, but they weren't really going out of their way to be mean to me. They were just, guards. And this was a jail. So they were basically treating me with the same attitude that they were treating the other inmates. And compared to my experience in Iraq, and compared to the time when I was underground, debating my conscience, jail was actually a pretty good time. I had a lot of time to think and to reflect and to read and write and to work out. And I made some really good friends. And part of me was sad when I left. So I had a really great time in jail.
Is there any way that we as the public could support you? I guess you mentioned letters and that, but any other way?
Absolutely. I think any way that you can find to help really counts. It doesn't really matter if you are a teacher and you can ask your students to write letters of support to whoever is in jail, or organizing your community to have people donate to the different organizations that are supporting veterans. For instance, Courage to Resist, Iraq Veterans Against the War, Veterans for Peace, Military Families Speak Out, Gold Star Families for Peace. There are a number of organizations out there, made out of veterans and military families who are organizing to help war resistors. And it's really important to try to find your own way to help them. Having a rally outside of a place where a war resistor is being held makes a huge difference, because that sends the message to the military that we are watching how you treat this war resistor. This person, Eli Israel, is afraid that because he's in Baghdad, the army is going to disappear him. But they can't do that because so many people know about him already. His name has made the rounds through the internet and the blogosphere, and that makes a huge difference. The military knows that people are waiting to see what's going to happen to Eli Israel. So if it takes, passing around an email or just talking about somebody who is taking a stance, that goes a long way. So, writing letters to your Congress people, to members of the military, writing letters of support, doing fundraisings, rallying, marching, any way you can counts.
Could I ask, is there any phone number that you know of whereby the Pentagon would take any criticism from the public? Any one that you know of right off?
I'm not really sure, but you can go to a website which is couragetoresist.org, and they usually adopt war resistors, and they do fundraising for them.
Okay.
And they publicize the stories about people who are resisting, and they help people with when they come out of jail, with money for their families, and they send them around on speaking tours and things like that. It's called Courage to Resist, and you can go to couragetoresist.org.
Yeah.
Like I said, you can go to Iraq Veterans Against the War. The website is ivaw.org. You can go to Veterans for Peace, which is veteransforpeace.org. And as you go to these websites and you meet people, you start networking. You go to one of these websites and it's going to have links to other resources, and that's how you can start basically finding out what's out there. And I know that there are a lot of peace communities here in the Portland area, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of those communities can tell you where else you can go and what else you can do, and those are all meaningful ways, and it all counts. There's no more convincing argument against war than the experience of war itself. So when I hear numbers about 25% of veterans coming back from the war applying for post-traumatic stress disorder, I ask myself, where is the other 75%? To me, it's inexplicable that we're going to have such a low percentage of people, traumatized in some way or another by the war. And it doesn't have to be combat. A lot of the trauma can take place when you hear stories from members of your unit. A lot of it has to do with the wounded that are coming back to the bases. For instance, that's what happened to Agustin Aguayo, who's a war resister who just came out of jail. He saw a lot of people coming back to his base that were basically dying and, were missing all kinds of body parts. And that changed him. So, to me, it's really hard to understand, these numbers that are coming out. And I think that part of the problem is that when people are coming back from Iraq, either before they get on a plane to leave the theater, which means to leave the Middle East, the war zone, they give them a survey where they ask them if they think that they may be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And if they say that they are, they keep them there and they send them to a clinic. And that could happen either in country or when they return to the States and they have to stay in a base to get treatment. What it is it's just a measure to discourage people from saying that they are in fact suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, because nobody wants to stay in a base when they come home. So I think that's part of the reason that explains that such low number of people is applying for treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. I think the number is increasing. And even with a low number of people applying for post-traumatic stress disorder benefits or treatment, the line is huge. And as the government says, support the troops, they're slashing VA budgets. They're closing down hospitals. And they're doing all kinds of things to draw money away from veterans' benefits and to put it into corporate pockets. So it's a real problem. How we're going to treat it, it's up to the community. We don't have all the answers, but I think that, supporting some of the groups that are dealing with veterans, it's a good way to start. One of the main things that helped me when I came back from Iraq was that I took a stance. And halfway through my tour, I said, I'm not going to be a part of it. And from studying psychology and from studying post-traumatic stress disorder, I know that the difference between two people who have gone through a traumatic experience and one of them ends up suffering post-traumatic stress disorder and the other one does not, is that the one that does not suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder actually did something about it. That if a person was being robbed or raped, fought. And that makes a huge difference in their mental ability to recover from that experience. And for a soldier or for anyone in the armed services, that translates into speaking out against the war, into organizing, into becoming politically and socially active with their communities. And that's going to take, the communities to come forward and embrace these soldiers and stand with them as they refuse and resist. So that's what happened with me. I had a lot of help first of all, from deciding not to go back to Iraq. Second of all, from going public, and also because of my activism. I think it has been a very soothing experience, and it's helped me heal a great deal.
I don't think it'd be a leap to think, especially given the setting, that most of us in this room are in agreement that the motives and the methods behind the current war in Iraq are not things that we would support. And I certainly honor men like yourself who are willing to stand up and say that despite having committed to something at a young point in my life, I'm not going to honor what is taking place that I feel is morally wrong. But, you know, I also, as I was a Peace Corps in Guatemala, and from my personal experience, I know I went for very specific and peaceful purposes, and yet it was very nice for me to know that if I had been threatened in a very significant way, there were Marines in the background who could help me and could take care of me and would get me to safety if that's what I needed. And when the question came up about the Navy SEAL, and I know I'm kind of rambling, but I'm trying to kind of get to this meaty point. The question about the Navy SEAL, I certainly know that I would not want my brother to be there. My partner's in Iraq for his second tour, and it doesn't bring me any peace at all. But I know that I wouldn't want to be entirely undefended either. And I guess I'm wondering, where do you stand in that? I don't know that I hear you advocating for the dissolution of the military, but I know that I hear you arguing that perhaps people shouldn't be joining. And I'm wondering, what do you see as that role? What is the role for the military as you envision it?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. And obviously, I'm no historian. However, you see, a lot of the crises that are taking place around the world are not entirely disconnected from what's happening at home. For instance, there's a lot of instability in Latin America. The brutal military dictatorship that ruled Nicaragua for over 42 years. And if you would have been there, you would have probably felt unsafe. But this dictatorship had the full support and financing of the United States. The string of dictatorships that repressed the people of Central and South America throughout the 70s and the 80s were people trained at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, where I became an infantryman, with the full support of the US government and the US military. So the question is not, what if there were no Marines to protect us when we find ourselves in these very unsafe situations? The question is, why are we creating these very unsafe situations? We cannot create instability and violence and then use that as a justification to continue expanding and financing the military-industrial complex. And that's exactly what we have been doing for a long time. When you look at Saddam Hussein, when you look at Osama bin Laden, when you look at the Ayatollahs who came as a reaction to the Shah in Iran, it's all what Chalmers Johnson calls blowback from our own actions. So it's not a matter of, are we going to have a military that's going to defend us, but are we going to have a government that is the most powerful country on earth that has a military so powerful that the earth has never seen so much power, that is going to be responsible enough to contribute to the creation of a world that is safe for everyone? And that is the real question, and that is the real challenge. It's not whether we're going to have a military to defend us, but whether we're going to have and really take a leadership role in the world to not create the situations of unsafety for everyone, not just for ourselves. Thank you.